April 1945. The German Reich was not just losing the war, it was disintegrating. Above ground, the American Third Army was pushing deeper into the heartland of a shattered empire, navigating through burning cities, retreating battalions, and the chaotic wreckage of a regime that had once promised to last 1,000 years. But the story we are telling today does not take place under the open sky. It takes place exactly 2,000 feet underground, in a freezing, pitch-black salt mine near the German village of Merkers. General George S. Patton, a man whose entire existence was defined by the roar of artillery and the aggressive forward momentum of tanks, was standing in a rickety, open-cage elevator. Beside him stood Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and General Omar Bradley. The descent into the earth took a full, agonizing 3 minutes. The air grew colder with every passing second, dropping to a damp, suffocating chill. They were not descending into this abyss to fight a battle. They were following an intelligence report. A rumor from local informants that the Nazis had hidden the entire gold reserves of the Reichsbank deep within the Kaiserroda mine. What they expected to find was national wealth. What they actually found in a sealed cavern designated as Room Number 8 would physically sicken the most hardened combat commanders of the Second World War. Patton had seen death in all its forms. He had commanded armor in the mud of France in 1918 and driven his men through the freezing, blood-soaked snow of the Ardennes just months prior. He was not a man who turned away from violence. He understood the mechanical, brutal arithmetic of war better than almost anyone alive. But a battlefield is a place of loud, chaotic destruction. The salt mine at Merkers was something entirely different. It was a place of silent, meticulous, industrial administration. As the heavy steel doors to the main vault were finally forced open, the flashlight beams cut through the absolute darkness. Yes, there was gold. Billions of dollars worth of Reichsmarks, stacked in neat, immaculate rows. There were priceless paintings, looted from the great museums of Europe, hastily shoved against the salt-encrusted walls. But Patton's eyes did not linger on the artwork or the national treasury. His attention, and the attention of every American soldier in that freezing cavern, was drawn to something else entirely. Stacked in the extreme back of the chamber, away from the glittering bullion, were 250 heavy, blood-stained burlap sacks. They were unremarkable at first glance. They looked like standard bags of grain or potatoes. But the weight of them was wrong. The shape was wrong. Patton stepped forward, his boots crunching against the salt floor. He ordered his men to cut the thick twine binding the top of the sacks. In the cavernous, echoing silence of the mine, the sound of the blade slicing through the burlap was unnervingly loud. And when the contents spilled out onto the cold stone floor, General George S. Patton did not yell. He did not curse. He did not issue a combat order. For a long, suffocating moment, he stood in dead silence. Eisenhower was the first to speak, but his voice was stripped of its usual command presence. It was hollow, barely a whisper that bounced off the salt walls. "Bring the townspeople here," he commanded, his eyes fixed on the burlap sacks that contained the remains of thousands who had been reduced to nothing more than property. "Bring them all, the mayor, his wife, anyone with a pulse in that village. They need to see this. They need to own this." Patton, for his part, had stopped pacing. The man who had been called Old Blood and Guts for his ruthless drive across Europe, the man who thrived on the kinetic energy of war, felt the crushing gravity of the room settle into his bones. He had led armies to kill enemies, to break fortifications, to secure victory. But this was not military science. This was the systematic industrial eradication of a people. And it had been conducted by the very culture that now insisted they knew nothing of the camps. The gold bullion in the other rooms of the mine was an act of greed, but these bags in the corner were the signature of a civilization that had lost its soul. As the general stood there, the silence in the vault deepened. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the suffocating silence of an open grave. There were no words for this. There were no manuals at West Point that taught you how to process the sight of 250 bags of human remains treated as inventory. Patton understood the implications immediately. He knew that if this evidence was allowed to vanish into the chaos of the war's end, if the truth was buried alongside the salt, then the war would have failed in its ultimate purpose. It wasn't enough to defeat the German army. The lie had to be defeated as well. The decision was made with a cold, terrifying precision. They would not just report this to headquarters, they would curate it. They would force the collaborators, the bystanders, and the deniers to witness the physical reality of their indifference. Patton, the general of movement and speed, began to realize that his next mission was not tactical, it was moral. He had to ensure the record of this horror was as permanent as the salt and the stone. The guards were ordered to secure the vault with triple locks. No one was to enter. No one was to touch the bags until the legal teams arrived. Patton knew that in the architecture of the post-war world, these bags were not just trash. They were the primary evidence for the judges who would one day sit in Nuremberg. He turned his back on the sacks, his face a mask of iron, and walked toward the elevator. The descent had been for gold, but the ascent would be for the truth. He was no longer just a commander of men. He was becoming the custodian of a nightmare that had to be accounted for. Every minute they spent in the mine felt like an hour, and every breath of the damp, tomb-like air felt heavy, with the weight of the thousands of lives that had been extinguished in the darkness of the Reich. Patton looked at Eisenhower, the silent communication between them absolute. The war, as they had understood it, was over. Now they were in the era of the aftermath, and the aftermath was going to be the hardest fight of all. Patton stepped out of the mine shaft and into the harsh, blinding sunlight of a Thuringian afternoon. The contrast was physically painful. Only moments ago he had been submerged in the darkness of the earth, surrounded by the inventory of genocide. Now he was back in the world of the living, a world that seemed dangerously oblivious to the reality that lay just beneath its feet. He walked toward his waiting staff car, his movements stiff, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He did not ask to be driven back to headquarters. Instead, he signaled for his provost marshal. "Find the mayor," Patton commanded, his voice devoid of his usual bluster. "Find the town council, find the school teachers, the shopkeepers, anyone who claims they are good, honest Germans. Bring them all to the mine entrance by tomorrow morning." The order rippled through the chain of command. For the soldiers of the Third Army, it was an unusual directive. They were conquerors, not tour guides, but they knew that when Patton gave an order, he had a tactical objective in mind. This was a different kind of maneuver. It was a siege on the conscience of the local population. The next day, the arrival of the civilians was a spectacle of calculated humiliation and necessary truth. They came dressed in their Sunday best, nervous, shuffling their feet, maintaining the practiced indifference that had allowed them to survive years of Nazi rule. They believed, perhaps, that they were being summoned to answer for some minor administrative failure or a curfew violation. They were not prepared for the theater of horror that Patton had prepared. Patton didn't make a speech. He didn't lecture them on the morality of the Reich. He simply stood by the mine entrance, his jaw locked, and gestured for the town officials to follow the MPs down into the shaft. He watched them descend. He watched the light of the outside world fade from their eyes as the elevator cage dropped into the cold, damp dark. For the first time in their lives, these citizens of the civilized world were being confronted with the literal waste of their ideology. They were led into room number 8. The air in the cavern was thick, heavy with the scent of salt and ancient decay. The MPs pulled back the tarps. The 250 bags were laid out like a harvest of bones. The reaction of the civilians was not one of righteous indignation. It was a desperate, crumbling denial. They averted their eyes. Some looked at the walls, some looked at the floor, some sobbed. But the most revealing reaction was the silence. It was the same silence Patton had felt in the dark. It was the sound of a worldview collapsing in real time. They had claimed they did not know. They had claimed they were merely patriots, not perpetrators. But standing before the physical evidence of the camps, in the middle of a salt mine turned into a cold storage warehouse for the dead, their excuses evaporated. Patton watched them from the back of the room, his eyes scanning their faces, cataloging every flicker of horror, every desperate attempt to look away. He wanted them to burn this image into their retinas. He wanted the guilt to be the last thing they thought of before they fell asleep at night. This was not about revenge. It was about ensuring that the truth was witnessed by the very people who had provided the cover for it. As he watched the mayor of the town collapse into a chair, shaking, Patton knew he had won a battle far more significant than any he had fought on the fields of France. He had stripped away the veil. He had forced the truth to confront the liar. And in that confrontation, he saw the true cost of the war beginning to crystallize. It was not just about territory. It was about the impossible burden of memory. The townspeople were gone, their faces etched with a dazed, hollow look that would likely never leave them. They had walked back to their village, silent, carrying the weight of what they had seen, and the silence of the mine seemed to follow them like a shroud. Patton, standing by his car, watched them disappear. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up into the crisp April air, but the familiar comfort of the tobacco didn't dull the edge of his mood. The war in Europe was nearing its end. The maps were turning blue and red with the progress of the Allied advance, but something had fundamentally shifted in the general's perception of the mission. Patton had built the Third Army to be an instrument of destruction, a force of nature designed to break the back of the Wehrmacht. But standing there at the mouth of the Merkers mine, he realized that winning the war was only half the equation. The other half, the one that the JAG, Judge Advocate General officers, had been whispering about in the corners of his headquarters, was the reckoning. He knew that if these 250 bags of gold teeth, the stolen art, and the mountains of looted currency were simply catalogued and handed over to the quartermasters, they would be viewed as mere spoils of war. They would be tallied up in a ledger and forgotten. But Patton saw them for what they truly were, the receipts of a mass murder. "Get me the legal section," Patton ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut the tension. "I don't want this looted. I want this documented. I want every bag, every ring, every piece of gold catalogued as evidence, not as booty." This was the pivot point of the Third Army's final weeks. Patton's commanders were used to orders to advance, to flank, to seize. They were not used to being ordered to perform forensic accounting on the remnants of a genocide. But Patton insisted. He understood, perhaps more than the lawyers in Washington who were still debating the charter for the Nuremberg Tribunal, that the speed of his army was a double-edged sword. If they moved too fast, they would leave a trail of uninvestigated crimes in their wake. If they slowed down, they might lose the momentum needed to end the conflict once and for all. He had to strike a balance. He ordered his legal officers to drop everything and descend into the salt mine. They worked under the same pressure that had defined their entire existence, the ticking clock of a collapsing regime. They were not just lawyers anymore. They were archivists of horror. They set up tables in the cold air of the mine, the harsh glow of floodlights illuminating the grisly reality of the bags. Patton watched the process from the periphery. He was no longer just the general who demanded polished boots and salutes. He was the general who demanded an accounting. He realized then that the Third Army would not just be remembered for the speed of their crossing at the Rhine or the audacity of their advance through Bavaria. They would be the guardians of the proof. The methodology that was being forged in that mine, the meticulous documentation, the witness statements, the chain of custody for evidence of war crimes was becoming the standard. It was a tedious, grueling, and deeply unglamorous task compared to the glory of the battlefield. But as Patton stood in the entrance of that mine, watching the lawyers sort through the evidence, he understood the historical necessity of it. Force could win the war, but only the law could win the peace. He turned his eyes back toward the front line, back to the war of movement, But the shadows of the Merkers mine remained, a stark reminder that when the fighting finally stopped, the reckoning would only be beginning. The paperwork that followed the discovery at the Merkers mine was not the kind of operational reporting that typically defined the Third Army. It was, instead, a massive, methodical exercise in legal preservation. Patton had ordered his JAG officers to treat the mine not as a conquered objective, but as a crime scene of unprecedented proportions. The 250 bags of gold teeth, the currency, and the looted art were no longer just recovered German assets, they were exhibits. Colonel Whitmore and his team of legal officers, working in the makeshift command posts that trailed the Third Army's advance, understood exactly what the general was asking of them. They were building a record that would eventually outlast the Reich itself. Every item pulled from the mine was tagged, photographed, and logged. Witness statements from the German mine supervisors, many of whom were terrified that they would be held accountable for the inventory of horror they had been forced to maintain, were taken in the precise, formal language required by international law. This was the methodology that had been forged in that farmhouse aid station weeks earlier, now scaled up to an industrial level. It was a race against the clock. The war was in its final, frantic gasps, and the Allied forces were moving at a breakneck speed that threatened to bury the evidence of Nazi crimes beneath a mountain of bureaucratic oversight. But Patton, having seen the contents of those 250 bags with his own eyes, refused to let the record become a casualty of the advance. He pushed his legal teams to the limit, demanding a standard of documentation that could withstand the scrutiny of the international tribunal that everyone knew was coming. He insisted that the chain of custody for the evidence be unbreakable. If the SS officer in the aid station had been shocked by the application of due process, the German High Command, now scattered and in hiding, would be utterly dismantled by the sheer volume and procedural perfection of the Third Army's records. The legal machinery that had begun as a response to a single, localized act of contempt against a medic had matured into a grand instrument of accountability. As the Third Army's legal teams compiled the Merkers documentation, they were unknowingly drafting the script for the Nuremberg Trials. They were turning the chaos of the battlefield into the cold, immutable reality of a court case. Patton's choice to prioritize the record over the immediate satisfaction of summary execution had created a precedent. The evidence from the mine would not be discarded. It would be presented. And as the legal packages began to be sealed and dispatched to Allied headquarters in London and Washington, the reality began to sink in. The Third Army was not just winning the war, they were setting the stage for the defining moral reckoning of the 20th century. The evidentiary trail that began in the dark, salt-stained tunnels of Merkers didn't end in Thuringia. It traveled across an ocean and into the most significant courtroom in human history. When the prosecutors at Nuremberg, men like Robert Jackson, stood to address the International Tribunal, they did not rely on abstract theories of guilt. They relied on the boxes of records that had been carefully logged, tagged, and authenticated by Patton's JAG officers under the immense pressure of the war's final weeks. The bags of teeth, the stolen currency, the looted art, they became the physical, undeniable proof that the Nazi regime had not just waged a war of conquest, but had orchestrated an industrial system of extermination. Patton, the man who lived for the roar of the tank engine, had ensured that the silent testimony of the dead would be heard through the cold, impartial mechanism of the law. He understood that without the record, history is merely opinion. Without evidence, justice is just another form of violence. Patton did not live to see the final verdicts. He was gone before the gallows were erected, taken by a tragic, mundane accident on a quiet road. A fate that seems cruelly ironic for a man who spent his life courting death on the battlefield. But the legacy he left behind in those legal documents was, in its own way, as permanent as the victories his army had won in the field. He had faced a moment of supreme temptation, the urge to let the horror slide, or to simply let the soldiers destroy the evidence in a fit of righteous rage. Instead, He chose the harder path. He chose to build a record. That choice, more than any tactical maneuver, defined his true contribution to the post-war order. It proved that even in the absolute insanity of total war, humanity could claw its way back to civilization by demanding an accounting. The final lesson of the Merkers mine was not about gold. It was about the fragility of truth. We look back at these events now and see them as inevitable, but they were fragile. They relied on specific people, a JAG officer, a supply sergeant, a general, making the correct decision when the easier, more violent choice was right in front of them. The story of the gold teeth is the story of what happens when we stop treating history as mere dates on a page and start seeing it for what it is, the desperate human struggle to keep our humanity intact under impossible pressure. Patton left us with a warning. Justice isn't a monument we build. It is an act of documentation and will that must be performed over and over again, or the silence returns. And in that silence, history is lost. The news of the Merkers Hall did not stay buried in the salt mine. It traveled through the Allied command structure, reaching Eisenhower's headquarters at Frankfurt with the speed of an electric shock. When the scale of the discovery was realized, the gold of the Reichsbank, the hidden art, the sheer industrial-scale theft, it became clear that the Third Army had not just uncovered a treasure trove. They had uncovered the financial artery of the Third Reich. Patton understood the danger. He knew that if this wealth were left in the hands of the administrative units tasked with securing assets, it would be treated as military property, a logistical line item to be balanced and traded. He blocked that route entirely. He designated the gold, the art, and the evidence of the atrocities as Class A documentation. It was not to be touched. It was not to be moved until the legal observers from the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force could personally authenticate every inch of it. This was the moment where the war for territory ended and the war for history began. Patton, the man who had written the book on armored maneuver, was now writing the manual on how to document the crimes of a state. He insisted that the legal teams treat the mine as a crime scene, not a warehouse. He demanded that photos be taken, not just for the files, but as a permanent, undeniable record of what had been hidden in the dark. The soldiers, who had spent months dreaming of the war's end, found themselves guarding, sorting, and labeling the physical manifestations of the regime they had been fighting. It was a heavy task. It forced them to stare into the abyss that the German leadership had tried to hide. There was no glory in this, only the grim satisfaction of holding the enemy accountable. As the evidence was crated up, ready for transport, Patton knew that the war against Hitler had been a matter of fire and maneuver, but the war against the Nazi ideology was a matter of proof. He was laying the foundation for a trial that would define the next 100 years of international relations. The bags of teeth, the gold, the stolen art, they were the prosecution's case in chief. They were the silent witnesses of a crime that the world had struggled to believe was even possible. Patton, the warrior, had become the prosecutor of an era, and he was ready to hand the evidence to history. Every crate sealed in that salt mine was a nail in the coffin of the Third Reich's denial. The documentation was meticulous, the chain of custody ironclad, and for the first time, the architecture of justice was matching the scale of the crime. The convoy that eventually rolled out of the gates of the Merkers mine was a surreal sight, a bizarre, heavy-laden procession of military trucks carrying the stolen loot of an entire continent. To an observer, it might have looked like a simple recovery operation, the spoils of war being collected by the victors. But for the men of the Third Army who had witnessed the inventory of room number 8, this was something else entirely. It was a funeral procession for the conscience of the German state. Patton watched the trucks rumble down the winding road, the heavy suspension straining under the weight of the evidence. He remained standing by the entrance, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes tracking the dust clouds kicked up by the departing vehicles. He knew that this evidence was destined for the highest levels of the Allied command. It was no longer a Third Army problem. It was a global imperative. The JAG officers, who had spent the last 48 hours working without sleep to ensure every bag and crate was cross-referenced, now rode in the lead vehicles, their expressions as stern as if they were guarding the crown jewels of an empire. The methodology they had pioneered, this cold, clinical application of legal procedure to the aftermath of carnage, was now becoming the blueprint for the trials to come. In the weeks that followed, word of the Merkers' discovery spread through the ranks, not as a rumor, but as a confirmation of the darkest suspicions the soldiers had held since crossing into German territory. The gold teeth, the wedding rings, the mountain of currency, these were the receipts of an industry of death. For Patton, the movement of this convoy felt like a final, decisive maneuver, in a war he hadn't fully understood when he first landed in Normandy. He had come to destroy an army, but he was leaving behind a mechanism for judgment. The evidence was moving toward the holding facilities that would feed the nascent legal teams in London and Washington, the men who were currently drafting the charter that would change the course of international law forever. He didn't need to be there for the trials. He didn't need to hear the testimonies of the survivors or the desperate, failing justifications of the high command. He had seen the proof in the salt, cold dark of the mine. He had felt the crushing silence of the room number 8. And he had ensured, through the uncompromising discipline of his legal teams, that the evidence could not be denied. As the last of the trucks vanished around the bend of the road, Patton turned back to his headquarters. The war of maneuver was effectively over, but the war for accountability had just been armed, and he had made sure the Allied prosecution had the ammunition they needed to win it. The months that followed the discovery at the Merkers mine were a blur of logistics and legal maneuvering. While the war in Europe officially ceased in May 1945, a new, more difficult struggle was beginning in the quiet, bombed-out buildings of Nuremberg. This was not a war of movements or artillery barrages. It was a war of words, of documents, and of accountability. When the International Military Tribunal finally opened its doors, the Defense Council, a collection of Germany's most brilliant legal minds, arrived with one primary goal: to dismantle the prosecution's case by challenging the legitimacy of the evidence. They were prepared to argue that the Allied documentation was biased, gathered under the conditions of a victor's vengeance, and therefore inadmissible. But they had not anticipated the Third Army's JAG documentation. When the prosecution teams, led by American Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, began to sift through the crates shipped from the Merkers mine, they found a level of precision that made the defense's arguments fall apart. The evidence was not just a pile of gold, it was a trail of paper. Every item in those 250 bags had been tagged, cross-referenced, and accompanied by sworn statements, exactly as Patton had demanded in that farmhouse aid station months prior. The courtroom at Nuremberg was cold and imposing, a stark contrast to the chaotic, mud-slicked reality of the front lines where this evidence had been secured. Yet, as the prosecution began to present the physical objects, the gold teeth, the looted watches, the rings torn from the fingers of the murdered, the defense team went quiet. These were not just statistics or distant, abstract accusations. They were tangible, undeniable proofs of a crime so vast it defied human comprehension. Patton's methodology had turned the tide of the trial before it even reached its zenith. By forcing his legal officers to adhere to the strict, often exhausting protocols of international law while they were still in the middle of active operations, he had stripped the defendants of their only line of defense: deniability. The German legal experts were effectively neutralized by the sheer procedural perfection of the records. Every time a witness took the stand, the prosecution didn't just ask them to describe the horror. They produced the documentation from the Merkers mine, complete with the signatures of the officers who had witnessed the recovery, and the timestamps that proved the evidence had been preserved with rigorous care. This was the true, final victory of the Third Army. They had not just occupied the territory of the Reich, they had secured the truth of its crimes. The courtroom, once a place where the defendants hoped to maintain their dignity, became an echo chamber for their own documented atrocities. The record, which Patton had treated as the most vital weapon in his arsenal, was now the gavel that would decide their fate. And as the days turned into weeks, the defense lawyers realized with growing horror that the machinery of law, once set in motion, could not be stopped. The crates marked with the Third Army's inventory seals arrived at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, standing out in the sterile, organized chaos of the trial preparations. They were not just wooden boxes, they were the physical manifestation of a regime's darkest secrets, extracted from the salt-cold earth and now brought into the harsh, fluorescent light of international justice. When the prosecution team began unsealing the packages, they weren't greeted by the chaotic, disorganized evidence usually found on a battlefield. They were greeted by the most complete, procedurally perfect record of atrocity in history. Patton's JAG officers had done what the defense counsel for the Nazis thought was impossible. They had created a chain of custody that was bulletproof. When the defense lawyers, men who had once been the masters of the German legal system, tried to raise their voices, claiming that the evidence was tainted or fabricated, the prosecutors merely opened the folders. They pointed to the signatures, the dates, the unit designations, and the specific citations of the 1929 Geneva Convention that Patton had insisted upon in that farmhouse weeks before. The defense had no counter-argument to a process that was, by their own standards, impeccable. This was the true, silent victory of the Third Army. While the headlines focused on the fall of Berlin and the collapse of the front, the quiet, painstaking work of documenting the gold teeth, the looted rings, and the stolen currency had achieved something far more lasting. It had set the precedent that individual soldiers and commanders could not hide behind the veil of following orders. The evidence from the Merkers mine made the Nazi leadership's claims of ignorance not just unbelievable, but legally impossible. As the trials progressed, the records from the Third Army became the backbone of the case against the German High Command. They bridged the gap between the battlefield and the courtroom, proving that the Holocaust was not a series of unfortunate, disconnected incidents, but a centralized, deliberate, and industrial operation. Patton, who was not a lawyer by trade, had understood a fundamental truth about power. If you don't document the crime, you haven't really won the war. He had given the prosecutors the one weapon they needed to secure a conviction that would echo through the decades to come. The mine was empty, the gold was accounted for, and the lie of the Third Reich was finally, irrevocably, laid to rest. The documentation was meticulous, the chain of custody ironclad, and for the first time, the architecture of justice was matching the scale of the crime.